Welcome to Emtron Training Part 13. In this tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at working with our cam and crank trigger setup within our EMTune software. Our cam and crank triggers will be specific to the engine that we're working with. It might be an OEM trigger pattern, it might be something aftermarket that we fit it to our engine, so we might be fitting something like an external crank trigger wheel or a different cam pattern. These all have to be accounted for within the EMTune software. So the Emtron is going to understand things like our engine speed, as well as the position of the engine within the auto cycle. We have to know this to be able to deliver the fuel and spark to the engine so it runs properly and gets proper combustion. There's going to be a whole bunch of things we go over here, learning the basic details of cam and crank patterns, learning how to work with an oscilloscope within the EMTune software so we can determine the actual pattern that we're working with, and other fundamentals such as a rising and a falling edge trigger. We have a lot to go over. Let's jump into our tutorial so we can check this out. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to be taking a look at how to configure cam and crank patterns within our Emtron ECU specific to the engine that we're working with. We might be having an OEM type of pattern that's specific to a newer engine, something like a BRZ engine or a Lamborghini engine. Those patterns are very unique, and we'll find that Emtron has defined those patterns in the sensor selection and details for us already, making it extremely simple. If we're dealing with a race engine where it might have a simplified pattern, we might be retrofitting an aftermarket cam and crank trigger setup, we'll find that those specific details can also be programmed into the Emtron, but we have to be paying attention to a lot of specific details in order for the Emtron to recognize the patterns properly, as well as the signal type from the sensor that's going to be picking up the actual pulses coming from the cam and crank trigger wheels. So we have a lot of little details here to cover. Let's jump in here. We're going to take a look at how to set up a custom multi-tooth type of trigger setup first, and then we'll move into the OEM patterns. But they're much more simplistic and there's a lot less setup, essentially just going in a drag and drop menu and just simply selecting whatever the particular engine you're working with is, so that pattern is going to be designated. So let's go in here and take a look at doing and setting up the actual custom type of cam and crank patterns. We're going to go in here and move from our tuning and jump into config. And then we're going to go here to engine setup, and then we're going to drop down here into engine decode setup. Now, if we go into sensor main, this is going to allow us to choose the specific cam and crank pattern that we're going to start off with. Now, looking at our list here, this is the list on the side, we can go in here and select whatever the number is based on the engine we're trying to control. Now, we can see here from number 3 all the way down here to something like 200 and 202, we can see that these are all the OEM patterns that are specific that we can select in our drop-down menu. Now, if we just select those, it'll be specifying what the pattern is going to be and what the sensor types are going to be, so that we really have no real configuration setup to do within the Emtron other than checking our timing, or the base timing, or the timing light, so that when we're locking the timing, our timing light will match to that lock timing value, and that we would have established the trigger offset value for the Emtron, so it knows where to calculate the proper spark timing from based on that pattern. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the video, but we'll find that there's very, very minimal setup. When we look at our first two options here, one tooth per TDC, and then specifically our multi-tooth custom, this is where we need to go in and understand all of these kind of fundamental details in working with magnetic or Hall effect sensor, working with a rising or falling edge trigger. This is going to allow us to specify and set up a trigger pattern that we've wired into the Emtron that is not going to fall in line with an OEM pattern. So the OEM patterns are usually odd number of teeth on the cam or crank sensors. So we have the teeth fitted to the actual crank trigger or the cam trigger. That's the wheel that's fitted to the camshaft or the crankshaft. And as the engine spins over, it'll actually pulse, and it'll have a sensor that's going to be picking it up. It'll create a pulse, and the pulse output is what the Emtron's going to read. These OEM patterns are going to be usually odd number of teeth or even unevenly spaced number of teeth. And that creates a problem because those patterns are unique and specific from the OEM manufacturer, and working with them. So the Emtron has went in and just allowed us to choose that particular pattern and went through and made all those setup details easy for us. In the multi-tooth custom, this is going to be typically evenly spaced teeth on a cam and crank pattern that we can actually go in and configure and set up. This is very common on older engines such as a 2JZ or a Honda BD or H series. They're even patterns. We might even be fitting a newer engine
with a simplified pattern and getting rid of the OEM pattern so we could fit a crank trigger wheel onto our crank balancer. We might be putting on something like a 60 missing 2 trigger wheel, which will allow you to retrofit and bypass the OEM pattern and retrofit an aftermarket pattern to simplify things. So there's all kinds of reasons why we might be working with a multi-tool custom, but that's the most complicated and the most intensive as far as setup, and that's what I want to start off this video with, because the OEM patterns, it literally is going to be choosing what engine or particularly what engine or what vehicle you're working with in our drop down here, and then just specifying that number here, and the Emtron's going to do the rest. Let's take a look at setting up our multi-tooth custom, because that is going to be the most time consuming. The first thing I want to talk about, as we're in our sensor main window, we are going to have our engine speed calculation. That's going to be designated here at 180 degrees.
Thanks for checking out our teaser clip. If you want to see the rest of this video and more than 500 hours of current EFI training we have to offer, make sure you click right here. If you want to go and check out more teaser clips from this training course, click here, and you don't want to miss any of the videos we're going to be releasing on this channel, so make sure you subscribe and click here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.